Very good. I'm glad that is visible. So, hi, I am Maddie, or Demereu online. I love that talk that Kigyo just gave. It's a really good in-depth look at a very specific part of visual novels. But I'm going to go into just basic UX UI design, um, making your game appealing and readable. So we're going to go into some really basic principles. I'm going to show you some concepts to keep in mind while you are working on your game. Um, just 8 things that I really like keeping in mind. And then I'm going to break those concepts down a little bit to make sure you kind of understand it a little bit. I'm going to link this deck to you guys after because I have a bunch of like resources and basic design ideas and terms and all that kind of stuff for you guys to peruse afterwards, just so that you can have a better understanding of design. Because I love design and I love making games that look good and I love reading games that look good. I'm sorry, my cat is going insane in the background there. So we're going to start with what is UX UI design. So UX stands for user experience, UI is user interface design. They're often lumped together, but they actually describe two kind of stages of the design phase. Um, so the differences between these two things: UX is basically the start. You're doing your research, your analysis of the designs. It covers structure, function, learning how a player, a user is going to go through the design, how they're going to experience and interact with it. You're going to be doing things like prototypes, wireframes, user flow charts. I'll go over those in a minute later on in the talk. Um, but yeah, you're asking the question of how will this product work? Where will people go? And all those kind of things. Whereas user interface, the design of it is about the aesthetics. It's about the look and feel. You want your game to be functional and easy to use, as well as appealing, but um, it is really about kind of the aesthetics of it. You're making the choices about typography, color, buttons, animations, all that kind of stuff. You're taking the research done by UX design and the prototypes and kind of making it more complex, uh, uh, increasing the fidelity of it. So yeah, you need to understand what the player likes to look at. Um, so they're very intertwined with each other, but definitely different things. So let's go into these basic concepts that I like to keep in mind. Um, this is just things that I like to consider kind of at the beginning and as I'm doing um, my design phase of projects. So number one, you always want to start with a concept. You want to go in, do your research, gather a bunch of inspiration, make sure that you have an understanding of how you want your game to function, how you want your game to look. Get a mood board together, throw a bunch of game UI that you like in there, make notes, make sure that you have a real good understanding of what you're going to be doing before you move on from like this kind of planning phase. What this does is helps you keep your design kind of consistent throughout. And it allows you to kind of, especially when you're working on a team, have these touch points with your team members to be like, oh, hey, this is what we wanted it to look like. This is why I'm doing this, making this decision. Um, Second, use your UI to tell your story. Yeah, UI can be boring and just be like a black and white thing, and you can make it as minimalist as you want, but it also functions as a really good way to make use of your game's narrative. So it doesn't have to be anything complicated, but You can bring in symbolism, you can bring in colors, you can bring in um, other things called skeuomorphism, which is essentially making things look like they would in real life. So, like a notebook for your journal. Um, and yeah, you want to even use it in key moments of your story uh, to like really bring together the whole game. You can change things up just as long as you're keeping things consistent throughout the game, but you can kind of, uh, yeah, really just use that as a tool in your storytelling. Third, be purposeful in all your design choices. So, oftentimes, especially in game jams, the inclination is to just kind of either copy what other games have done or just kind of put things down where they are because you just got to go as quick as you can, um, or because it looks cool. Uh, but you want to take that time and stop and say, okay, why am I doing this? Why did this game do this? Um, and really think of like how your players are going to use the UI. So, for instance, like you take a look at the quick menu in visual novels. Most of the games put it down at the bottom, centered, and that's for like quick, easy access. But some games put it in like a little side quick menu, like thing where you have to either hover over or click into it, which can look really cool, but kind of ruins that quick access of it. So you want to understand these design choices and like be purposeful in why you're making those decisions. Can be a readability issue, could be an accessibility issue, that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, this is why the planning stage is really important. Is that you kind of like uh, plan out all of those things, make sure that you understand why you're doing these things. Fourth, consistency is key. So I did a lot of research to go into this presentation, and consistency is key is like a statement that is thrown around a lot on the internet, and it really does make sense. The choices that you want to make in your design need to be consistent so that people understand uh, when they're in your game, like what they're doing, essentially. Like you don't want to have a button that says settings lead you to the preferences and settings menu, and then another button that says settings or has like a little cog symbol not send you to that same place. The same goes with like headers and typography of headers and buttons being all kind of at least similar. Um, when you don't make something consistent, when something is different, it calls attention to that thing. So unless you want to do that, you should make sure that everything is consistent. And there are parts of design that is like, okay, I do want to call attention to it, um, but you need to know when you're doing that. Um, so number five, interaction over decoration. UI can look really cool, really snazzy, but you always need to make sure that the design is usable, that people can read the text boxes, that people know what the buttons are for, that they can click the buttons. Um, all of these interactions with your UI need to be usable over looking cool. Um, and that's especially true in visual novels. When you're having like over 50,000 words that people need to read in your text box, it's really important that you make sure that that interaction with your game is usable. um, but you can still make it decorative. You just need to make sure that the interaction functions over that decoration. Number six, focus your player's attention. This goes along with number five. You want to make sure that you're driving the player's attention to the place that you want them to be paying attention to. Um, so this is, for instance, when you have a section in your game where you just want people to read. You don't want to have like a flashing button or something off to the side that is uh, drawing their attention away, because it'll make it a lot harder for them to be focusing on the longer paragraphs of the story. This will inevitably frustrate people and maybe even detract over the game overall. Um, you got to think, where do I want this player to be looking at, and what is important for them at that time. Number 7, create intentional white space. I will go over what white space means, but it essentially is a concept in design that is about the space in between objects. So if you want to see, for instance, the numbers here in this slide, I've intentionally used the negative space of that color to make the number 7. But it's more than that. It's also the space between the numbers, between the paragraphs. Um, you want to be intentional with this space because it's important to create flow throughout your game. Think about how navigation menus work. You want to make sure that people are reading the buttons correctly and then looking down at the content of the menu, and making sure that they're looking at the proper places in the menu. And white space is really important for this because it enforces how people read. Um, but it can be kind of a double-edged sword, because if you put too much negative space or white space, you end up confusing things. So it's this middle zone this Goldilocks zone that you want to figure out. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to understand that. But yeah, too much, too little can confuse the player. So you want to make sure that you're very intentional with the space between your design elements. Number 8, know when you need to simplify. There are certain parts of the game's UI that always needs to be simple. I'm calling out text in text box. I'm calling out names as well in the text box. You want your buttons to be simple so they're readable. Just if there is too much complication in these elements, they start to be less usable and less able to be interacted with. So always start as simple as you can and then move on to making things more complicated with like decoration and stuff, maintaining that readability at all times. Yeah. And then lastly, rules are always meant to be broken, but you have to be purposeful with the breaking of these rules. In general, design is about functionality as much as it's about aesthetics. So if there is like something that you really want to do, just as long as it's readable, try it. I mean, there's no harm in doing it and just testing afterwards. You just don't want to detract from the gaming experience. So yeah, just be purposeful in what rules you break. So let's break down some of these ideas. I'm just going to go over a few concepts that will help you keep those 8 basic ideas in mind. So mood boards and inspiration. I have an example of what I did up there as a mood board like thing that I did. This was for my game, The Nest. I went in, grabbed a bunch of inspiration, made a bunch of notes, made sure I understood why I grabbed those inspirations by taking notes, and kind of did like a design file. I also like using Figma's Jamboard as well, where you can just add in a bunch of images. Just make sure that you understand and the other team members understand why you've added in those parts of the mood board. Otherwise, it's not as useful. But yeah, inspiration is always good. Just don't copy things. At least one for one. Next, we have player interaction flow. This is kind of a harder concept to understand, and you don't really need to do it for like game jams and stuff because it's usually used for like longer term projects. But it's really good to understand where your players are going and when. So doing like the chart and stuff isn't important, but knowing that you want to go from the main menu to save load save with settings, and then the start game, and the start game goes to story choices and so on, and then just plotting out everything in at least in your head, and understanding that interaction is kind of important. This is also very important if you're bringing in new concepts to your game. So if you're doing a visual novel with some other genre added into it, then you want to make sure that you understand the way that interaction will go. So wireframes and prototypes. As I said, I did a lot of research, so I found this really cool article done by Riot, where they went over their prototyping, and I thought that was a really cool show of how you can do it. I don't do it a lot in my visual novel like game jam stuff, just because it takes too long, unless there's some kind of like animation that I need to explain to the programmer. But yeah, wireframes are the basic framework of your game. You want to keep out color images or any like specific words unless it's important to have. So on the right, there's a bunch of examples of wireframes or parts of wireframes that I did for a bunch of my games. Just plain boxes with like basic words to understand where things go and kind of the size of things. It's really useful for programmers as well in these like game jams that you do, that they can kind of go in and start programming things before you actually have the design ready. Just a really good reference tool to start discussions as well. So contrast, I know we talked about this really in Kigyo's work or presentation, sorry. Vibrating colors is that contrasting complementary colors. You don't want to do that when you have elements that are you need to like read, essentially. Kind of hurts the eyes. So what you can do is you can limit the saturation, change the temperature and the tone of it. You can add contrast and textures in different typography and shape. It just adds interest to your game and also allows you to call out elements in the design. Just be careful with the use of contrast, because if you use too much, it gets muddled. And then visual hierarchy. This is the idea of making sure that the most important things are the most visible things, secondary less so, and then tertiary even less so. So creating good hierarchy allows people to really easily pick out what's important. And there's lots of ways to do that, but threw in a bunch of examples there. Size, texture, white space, color, and even proximity can add visual hierarchy. Went over consistency as well. Sorry, I'm gonna go a little quicker because I know I'm at the time already. Consistency in your UI. So there's an example from the nest again, all the same colors, all the same textures, same shapes, and then keeping it readable. Here's a bunch of examples. You don't want to add too high contrast where things need to be read. You don't want to add things that are too close. give things breathing room. So that's that negative space again, in order to make it readable. All right, and then here's the basic design terms for you to peruse later. There's a bunch of them here, things that are just interesting and good to know. And then here's a list of resources that I use in my daily design um, experience, I guess. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for joining me. And I will take questions now.
Awesome. Great to see like a mini UX block happen.
Yeah, there's so many concepts to go over. That's not even half of it, but
Oh
tried to
yeah.
go over the important stuff.
Yeah, what can you do? You can't shove design school into a 20-minute talk. So
No.
okay, there are some questions here. So let's do one
Cool.
here. So here's one question. Do you have an opinion on when games move some or all of their I'm definitely a video game UI into their world, such as using a settings app on the main character's phone? Do you have any do's or don'ts when doing this to avoid player confusion or breaking the immersion that comes from moving them in game that this whole moving in game is supposed to avoid?
Okay, so that's essentially what's called skeuomorphism. So using a real life object as a representation in your design. And I think that's a really smart way to kind of create that immersion. It's just important to know that it can be a little confusing on if you're using the phone for, say, like your game's like in-game messaging between characters and stuff, or like the in-game camera, that having the game's like the whole game's settings in the phone can be a little bit confusing. um it's up to I think it's up to you to decide if that's too confusing. Personally, I would keep in-game stuff and like game UI separate. um, but you could still create kind of a skeuomorphism by um, making something similar but different for the game menu, if that makes sense.
All right. Another question is, do you have any tips or resources for designing UI for use with controllers or Steam Deck?
Unfortunately, I don't have anything specific. I do have some YouTube channels on the left here that do cover specifically like games with video, like with more controllers. These are pretty popular YouTube channels. So um, I think what is important to know is um, not to overcomplicate things. So if you are, for instance, making a camera and you're trying to make something that has like 5 different buttons to press to make it work, that's not going to be usable. It's not going to be fun for the player. So you got to find a way that you can use maybe one or two for a camera for like the zoom and then the taking the picture aspect. But unfortunately, I don't have any resources for that.
All right, so we are at time. So thank you so much for this talk. I love having UX because I work in the UX team. So this is great. Oh
Awesome.
yeah, I'm part of the universe, though. I'm a researcher, not a designer. Still,
Yeah.
same
Awesome.
deal.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Uh-huh.
Bye.